As you know well, and I suspect members of our audience also know, just yesterday, Brazil reported the biggest drop ever in gross domestic product, almost 10% from the first quarter. Tell me, please, about your outlook for the economy through the end of the year and also in 2021.
Thank you for the question. Yesterday we had the second quarter. The second quarter, as of now, is a bit like looking in the rear mirror. We are seeing the economy picking up, and the more real-time data suggests that we are starting to have a recovery, V-shaped. But I think as we go along, it will probably slow down a little bit, but continue to be a sound recovery. The number that came out yesterday, 9.7, actually has some interesting features, because in the agro part, Brazil is doing really well. We actually have a positive number, which means that the agricultural machine in Brazil never stopped. The service part was a little bit, probably a little bit worse than we expected. The industrial production and everything else that connects to it was a little bit on the expected part. But it's interesting to note that if you look at the last 5 weeks, the economic agents have revising the growth in Brazil a little bit on the better side. So it was until some time ago that you had a lot of people forecasting -10, -9 for this, something between -5.5 and -4.5. So we think that the third quarter will be positive. We can see the anecdotal evidence pointing to that. And then the doubt is whether the fourth quarter will grow more, or if the growth will slow down a little bit because of the effects that will go from the fiscal expenditures. We tend to think that the fourth quarter will be better than what the market's forecasting. And for next year, we also think that our growth is better than the forecast. It obviously all depends on a lot of external factors and internal factors related to the way the economic agents see our program, the credibility that we can generate, and the way we interact, these variables interact.
Governor Campos Neto, based on what you just said, based on what you can see now, 2/3 of the way through the third quarter, and based on your expectation that the fourth quarter is going to be, as you said, I think, slightly better than what the market expects, what would you anticipate at this moment the full year decline for 2020 will be in GDP?
It's going to be around -5%, with next year growing a little bit more than 4%.
So in both cases, if I'm not mistaken, that is better than what, well, as you pointed out, some private economists see GDP dropping by less than 5%, but growth in excess of 4% would be substantial for 2021, particularly considering where the economy was in the second quarter.
Yes, you have two groups of people. You have one group of people who is revising better the growth this year, but is shaving off the growth of next year, because they think the stimulus is stronger this year, but there's going to be this headwind once the stimulus phases out. And there's another group of people that says, no, what I'm seeing is a strong recovery. I think that the assumptions that I had in terms of the economy stalling due to the pandemic, the reactions being better, and so they're updating this year better without changing next year. So we have this two group of people today.
Amount of public spending. Like many countries, Brazil has been handing out cash during the pandemic to support the economy and to help families. Earlier this week, that stipend, the monthly stipend, was cut in half to 300 reais, about $55 from 600. What impact is that going to have on the pace of the recovery?
I think it's important to quantify the overall group of measures that we're taking to face the pandemic. When you look at what the other countries are doing, you can basically divide in 5 parts. Monetary policy, which Brazil did aggressively, moving interest rates from 4.5 to 2. liquidity and capital measures, which we also did aggressively. Liquidity measures amount to 16.7% of GDP. Capital measures amount to 17.5% of GDP. So those are the two groups. Then you have taxes, which is either delaying or canceling taxes. Then you have the direct transfers, and then you have the credit lines. When you look at direct transfers, Brazil did a huge program of direct transfers based on the poor, on the lower part of the population, on the poorer population, on the people who needed the most. And also we had a bunch of credit programs that are in place right now. Some of them took a little bit longer than we expected, but all of them are in place right now. And we actually had some that started this week. When I look at the amount of money that was done, that was transferred directly, plus all the credit programs, I see an impulse that is strong enough to take us to the first, between January and February of next year. So yes, there is always a time decay from the fiscal expenditure that will tend to phase out, and we needed to phase out because it was impossible for Brazil to keep paying 600 reais to everybody every month, because then it would get into another dimension, which would be more problematic, which is a lack of credibility in the fiscal front. So I think Brazil did what it could. It did a big program, bigger than almost any other emerging market countries, bigger even compared to some developed countries. It paid a lot of attention to the poor people, and also developed a lot of credit programs that will attend the mid-size and the small-size companies.
Could we take a moment, Governor, to talk about poor people? That's who the stipends, the monthly stipends, have been helping the most. And by some measures, as you may be aware, that stipend has served to reduce poverty in Brazil almost to record low levels. Given that achievement, are you confident that the government will either be able to or have the appetite to eliminate the stipend at any time in the near future?
No, I think we have two constraints. We know that we have around between 20 and 25 million people that we need to take care, and they are now surviving off the transfers. And we also know that we have fiscal limitations, and that if we don't take care of the fiscal limitations, what's going to happen is we're going to lose credibility of going back into what we were in the past. And that would probably force us to have higher interest rates. Expected inflation will go higher. So we don't want to go back into where we came from a couple of years ago. So we have these two dimensions. We need to take care of the population. We need to take care of the poor people, but we need to understand that we have fiscal limitations. When you look at the program, it's more than just transferring money. Brazil was able to digitalize more than 40 million people. There were people that were invisible to the government before the program. So the program actually were able to identify people, to map people. We can do things with these people that are now digitalized. For example, we are talking now about microcredit programs and other things. We need to keep the economy moving, but we need to give them jobs. So I think that's the next challenge that we have ahead.
I know how important restoring credibility is to you, or maintaining fiscal credibility is to you. I know how important it is to the economy minister, Mr. Guedes. Is it as important to the president? Is it as important to members of Congress?
I think there was a clear demonstration in the last week and a half, that everybody understands the limitation that we have in terms of the fiscal. I always say, in the case of the central bank, I always say that we are not the driver, we are the passenger. The driver is the fiscal. It's impossible to have low rates and low inflation with fiscal indiscipline. And I made that very clear. Our communication, official communication, states that in every way. Even when we changed the language to adopt something of a forward guidance, we made clear that that could be an impairment of our policies going ahead.
What would you say are the biggest risks to the recovery right now?
I think the biggest risk, because it's a pandemic, is always a movement of a second wave that affects the world in a way that we don't expect today, or that everybody's believing that we have a vaccine and for some reason it doesn't work. The thing that damages the economy is what the economists are now calling the scaring effect, which is people will change their behavior in a way that they won't consume as much, or they won't spend as much. We have the professional savings that is increasing in most of the countries. So I think it's more related to the pandemic and the behavior than anything else. I would say that's the main risk right now.
It appears, Governor, that Brazil will, once this is all said and done, have had the shallowest recession of any of the major economies in Latin America. In retrospect, was the government's decision to, let's say, downplay the effects of the pandemic and reopen the country for business the right decision?
It's not. I don't think it's the job of the central bank to evaluate that. For us, we take everything as inputs. What I think people evaluate at some point in time is how efficient was the lockdown. And to measure how efficient was the lockdown, you need to understand that you have a corridor. When you tighten the conditions, people tend not to leave. But that has some efficiency, and the efficiency is going lower and lower. When we unlock, when we remove the restrictions, people try to have more mobility. But that's not going back to normal too, because you have scaling effects. So what you have is you have this corridor of efficiency between locking down and not locking down, and you have the cost of the lockdown. If you look at emerging markets, this corridor tends to be narrow. In other words, when you lock down, people don't really respect and it's hard to enforce. And when you unlock, people don't go back to their normal lives. So I think what matters for us at the end is what is the cost and what is the efficiency of what is being done. And what we notice as time goes by, the efficiency of the lockdown is less and less, but the cost is the same. So I think this is what people will be talking about in the next weeks to come.
Coming at too great a cost and don't make sense any longer?
First part of the question, because I couldn't hear your voice. If you could repeat again, sorry about that. It's a bit of a technical problem here.
We're doing our best to communicate over long distances. I understand. What I was saying is, given what you just said about the efficiency of the lockdown versus the cost of a lockdown and the decline in the efficiency or efficacy of the lockdown, is that to say that at this point in the pandemic, with the need to get the economic recovery back on track, it doesn't make sense to lock down economies any longer? The cost is too great relative to the efficacy.
Unless you have a way of improving the efficiency, that's what I'm saying. What we've noticed in Brazil and other emerging markets is the efficiency is going lower and lower. I think what we need to, as the central bank, we don't evaluate this. It's not our mandate. What we take is the variables that come from the actions that the government is doing. And it seems to us now that the economy is recovering. A lot of places are opening slowly. You have variables that show us that the mobility, even the places that are now back to normal, the mobility has not gone back to normal. And in some cases, you have very few cases, and the local government has decided to do a bigger shutdown, and then the cost was very big for an efficiency that was not so big. So we try to just analyze the variables. Again, the central bank should not be involved into giving a lot of opinions on that. But what we do is to try to measure the efficiency.
Governor, what kinds of longer-term effects, a hangover, if you like, do you see the pandemic having on the Brazilian economy and Brazilian society?
I think when I look more on the longer term, and when I talk to other central bankers and talk to other economists in other countries, the recovery has some common factors. I think the fact that everybody's suffering, rich country, poor countries, everybody's suffering the same, is bringing people together. And there are some common points that I think are very important. I would probably say there are three dimensions that will be common in every shape of recovery and everywhere. The first one is that the growth will have to be inclusive and sustainable. And it's going to be very difficult for any country to try to move away from that. I think what people are demanding is a growth that is inclusive and sustainable. So you have people talking about basic income programs in every country. You have people talking about sustainability, environment, and all this stuff in every country. So that's the first part. The second part, which is also common to every country, is that you have this intensifying movement in technology. So the growth will be more technology driven than anything else. You can see that in medicine, education, communication. We are doing this right now over video. So, and then the third part is what's going to be the new norm of global trading. So when you look at global value chains and the fact that some countries now understand that having a very important supplement concentrated, the production concentrated in one country, maybe is not the best way to go. We're seeing some dislocation in the global value chain. So I think those are the three parts that will be common to growth. In our case, it's important to be inclusive because there was a crisis that hit the poor people in Brazil, and we need to address that. And we need to tell the world that we also care and worry about the sustainable growth.
Will the global shift in supply chains affect Brazil positively or negatively?
I think Brazil was not so much inserted in the global value chain, and we suffer from that because other emerging market countries converged more rapidly because they were more inserted in the global value chains. That means that we did enjoy the movement, but also means that we suffer a little bit less. And the second point is Brazil has been, a lot of the growth has been concentrated in agriculture. And Brazil is becoming one of the largest food producers in the world. And people need to eat. So, and we can look at that. And for example, look at the number that was out this week. Agriculture is still growing in the middle of everything. So I think puts Brazil in a different position from many other emerging market countries.
The government in Brazil had a bold program to cut public spending and reform the economy. Then, of course, the pandemic struck. What is the future of that program now?
The future is clearly to go back into what we think makes sense for Brazil. And what it makes sense is to have fiscal discipline, to have a growth that is fostered by private and not public, to improve efficiency, to free the economy, to open the economy, to privatize, to diminish the size of the state. I think we are going in the same direction. I think what the COVID represents for Brazil is a bit of a detour. Our fiscal got worse because we needed to take care of people. But the fact that we have a ceiling that limits our expenditure, to the contrary of what many people say, I think is the opposite. The ceiling was what enabled us to spend more money because the market agents knew that we needed to go back to fiscal discipline. So I think we need to reinforce that. We need to give the message that we are serious about fiscal discipline and we are serious about a growth that is led by the private sector. Because we've tried to grow based on public expenditure and it hasn't worked. And we've tried many times and the last one ended up very badly. So we know for a fact that that was the right way to go. And by the way, before the COVID hit us, when you look at the first 2 or 3 months of the year, we were doing very well. I mean, the private growth was over 3%. The public growth was down, so it was slowing down the country a little bit. But we were doing this reshuffling that we thought was very healthy for the sustainable growth in the long term.
You know, if the economy, or if public, let's say it this way, if public policy had to take a detour because of the pandemic, how long does the detour last? And what conditions need to be met before you can put the program back on track?
No, I think we had a detour. I mean, we were one of the emerging market countries that spent the most money. So we did have a detour. We thought that was important, and the timing that we did was very efficient. If you look at other countries, even developed countries, US is still sending checks in the mail. We've paid 120 million people in 5 weeks. And we digitalized more than 40 million people. So it was very efficient. But it's a detour. We needed to do that, but we need to understand that we need to go back to the original plan. If for some reason there was an intention of the government not to go back, to become, to spend more money, to create a new model for development, in the last couple of days, the market's been punished in Brazil very badly when you have bad fiscal news. So I think pretty much, by and large, the community understands that we need to go back to the plan. We need to spend in a responsible way. And I think there is a consensus around that now. I wouldn't worry so much about changing the program. I think there is a lot of noise, but I think by and large, people understand what we need to do.
And what about the timing? How long do you think it will take before economic policy can get back onto the reform track?
This is actually a feature that Brazil has that's different from many countries. And when I get around and talk to other central bankers, people tell me sometimes, you have one thing that some other countries don't have, which is every measure that you created has a time to end. We created a separate group of measures in Congress and expires December 31st, every one of them. So it's like you start with a measure, you created a law, but it has a date to end. If you look in other countries, many countries will now have to go to Congress to reverse the measures that they created. We don't need to do that. Everything expires in December 31, most of the measures. What's going to come out of that, and I think that puts us in a good spot, is that we have the measures that expire, and we have the ceiling that forces us next year to go back into spending not more than the budget of the year before plus inflation. So I think we have these two things that limits our ability to move away from the program, which is everything has a date to end, and we have a ceiling that we need to respect next year. And that is not the same. It's not true for every country. If you look around, you're going to see that now people are worried about how organized will the exit be. The exit in Brazil is already organized because it has a date to end.
And you're confident, I take it, Governor, that that deadline, December 31st, won't be extended because of what you describe as a consensus among policymakers. And if that consensus breaks down, the discipline the market will enforce. Is that correct?
Talking to people in the Congress, I have the information that I have is that it won't be expanded. They might look at some specific things, but that it won't, and I think it shouldn't.
Governor, you took office in February of 2019 with reform priorities of your own. Have those priorities changed as a result of the pandemic?
When I took office, the central bank had a very good management prior prior to coming to my initiation, and that gives us a lot of room to look into what we call the BC# agenda, which was an agenda to promote competition, to promote inclusion, to promote a change in the way we see financial intermediation. So there was a lot of the program was actually directed towards technology. We haven't changed any of those programs. Everything that was in the initial agenda, we keep track of it. We haven't moved any dates. The instant payment that's going to be applied widely to Brazil, we will start. Actually, we actually moved. We anticipated that it's going to start in November. We have an open banking system that will be the widest of any country. It's going to actually be more like what we call now the open finance system, and that is in track, and we're well ahead of phase one. We have a change in the way we see the currency, and we have a package that will be voted in Congress in the next few weeks. Then we move to internationalizing the country. Then we move into have a convertible currency. Everything meets at the end, the open banking, the PIX, and the more modern currency. and the plan is to have a digital currency by then. So we haven't changed anything. This program continues.
And I suspect we'll come back to some of these issues a little later in the conversation, but since you brought it up, how long do you think it will take before Brazil has a digital currency?
I think the digital currency is not what you search, it's not the cause, it's the consequence. For you to have that, you must have in place a system of instantaneous payments that is efficient and interoperable. You need to have an open system in which you can create competition, and you need to have a currency which is has credibility, is convertible, and is international. Then I think you have all the ingredients to have a digital currency. We think we're going to get to that by 2022.
By 2022, so sometime next year.
No, 2022.
Sometime in 2022. Okay.
Yeah.
Governor, achieving independence for the central bank has been one of your priorities. How realistic is that objective today?
I think it should be voted in the next couple of weeks. I actually yesterday had a conversation with both the president of the Congress, the lower house, and the president of the Senate. I understand that it's independent COVID, but I think it's now we are going back into the original agenda. I think it should be voted in the next couple of weeks.
We lost you for just a second, Governor, so if you wouldn't mind answering the question again. You were saying that you had a meeting yesterday, or you spoke yesterday with the president, with the head of the lower house and the head of the Senate. And you, describe, if you wouldn't mind again, what you learned from those conversations.
Sure, no problem. So it's my understanding that's going to be voted in the next couple of weeks. It is in the priority package post-COVID measures, and will be put to vote in the next couple of weeks.
Tell me something. Why is independence important? And I ask that question because, as you're aware, what we see in practice now in developed markets is a move toward what you actually have in Brazil, which is something of a marriage between fiscal and monetary policy. Some have even questioned whether the Fed, for example, remains as independent as it was. So go into some detail, if you don't mind, given what we see happening elsewhere in the world, why it remains important for Brazil to have an independent central bank.
I will start with the later part of the question, which is how do we see the central bank operating in the crisis? And we have to be very careful with the marriage that you mentioned, because it could end up in a bad divorce. So what we try to say, and what we try to do here, is understand that you have two kinds of problems. You have solvency problems, and you have liquidity problems. And the central bank should have all the tools to fight liquidity problems. It's obvious that if you don't have liquidity for a long time, you end up having solvency problems. But when we approach the problem, we think the task of the central bank is not to solve solvency problems and structural problems in the economy. Is to make sure that we solve the liquidity problems. That means monetary policy, means having liquidity and capital for this financial system to work, means having credit programs that will reach people who need the credit program. So we try to draw this line between what is our task and what it's not. And I think when you start crossing that frontier, doing fiscal policy, for example, in the balance sheet of the central bank, we think that could end up badly, and it could make it very difficult for an organized exiting strategy. So that's the later part of your question. Why is the independence so important in Brazil? Because I think it's going to be a very important institutional autonomy today. So we already have autonomy today. I think it will be a very important improvement in terms of institutional gain and institutional framework. We will decouple the mandate of the central bank governor with the presidency, with the executive power, so that will give more freedom to the central bank. We will have the directors with mandates that are also not coincident with the president, so that the president doesn't have a lot of power and needs to understand that things need to be organized in a way that you follow the cycle. I think overall, the understanding is that we're going to remove the power a little bit from the executive. The legislative is going to have more power on the central bank, and the central bank could move and look at a more longer horizon than the mandate of the executive. And I think that's a very good gain. If you look at what happened in the central bank in Brazil, at sometimes these lines crossed a little bit, and the central bank lost credibility. And also, I think if you are able to show that and gain this credibility, you actually lower your structural interest rate, and you are able to survive and to live longer with lower inflation.
Governor, I'm intrigued by what you said just moments ago, that the marriage of fiscal and monetary policy could end in a bad divorce. Are you all about what you see happening elsewhere? For example, the Fed's role in the U.S. economy transforming to one where one of its principal jobs is monetizing fiscal deficits?
I don't think it's the job of the Central Bank of Brazil to comment on other central banks. I think countries have different structure. For example, in the central bank, in Brazil, the central bank is within the central administration. The Fed is not. In Europe, you have a different system. So it's not really my job or our task to give a guideline on what I think the system should be in other countries. But what I was telling you is what we think we should be, given our constraints and given our institutional arrangement.
And if this marriage that exists currently in Brazil between fiscal and monetary policy were to end in a bad divorce, what would that look like? What is it that concerns you?
No, when I mean bad divorce, I mean the central bank losing credibility. But that's not happening in Brazil. If you look at the measures that we adopt in the central bank and what is being designed by the Minister of Economics and what is being designed overall, we have a clear distinction and a clear separation between what is liquidity and what we are doing and what the other programs are doing and who is responsible for the other programs. I don't think we have crossed this line in Brazil.
Governor, Congress gave you the power to buy government and corporate bonds, quantitative easing, and you haven't used that power yet. I'm curious to know why.
When we look at what we can do facing the crisis, it's like we have a box full of tools. And you have to understand that every tool has one function and that you have to prioritize the tools. What we have said is that using a lot of tools before exhausting your main tool, which is monetary policy, tends to lead to a lower credibility. In other countries, we think the main instrument is monetary policy. So,
Governor, is that to say the Selic, the benchmark rate, would need to go to zero or something close to zero before you would be prepared to employ QE?
No, we've said that we have a lower bound in Brazil and that the lower bound is dynamic, and we spent a lot of time describing the way we see that. We also said in our communication that we see little or no room to do further cuts, but we also recognize that we needed to have stimulative conditions. And because of that, we introduced the element, the instrument of forward guidance, which was done, and it's not very common in emerging markets. If you look at what the market did right after we implemented that, the middle of the curve immediately lowered, so we had an effect from what we're doing. Actually, we had a meeting 2 days after the Copom meeting, and we were actually surprised by the market reaction, which was actually bigger than we expected to some extent. Then came the fiscal worry, and then the curve steepened again. But this is just an example to tell you that we have our tools and we have the priorities. When we look at the possibility of buying credit and buying public debt, as of now, we see this more as a tool to avoid market disturbance or market discontinuity than an instrument of monetary policy.
Is that to say, not what you just said, but what you said as a preface to that, that at the moment you see 2% as something of a floor for the Selic?
What we said is, if there is room, we think there is not a lot of room, so there's a little room, if any. That is a decision that we're going to take in the Copom meeting. We also explain the conditions around what we think is the lower bound and why we think we are close to a lower bound. And we include a more specific explanation of some of the dimensions that we had mentioned. For example, the prudential dimension, the fact that the cost of credit in Brazil today is more connected to the cost of liquidity and the cost of capital than the cost of funds. So we explain a lot what we mean by lower bound so that the market can understand with transparency.
Governor, for as long as I've been around, Brazil was always a country of high interest rates, the land of the carry trade. Did you ever imagine that as governor of the central bank, you'd, over the course of your tenure, approximately a year and a half, cut rates by a total of 450 basis points, and that the benchmark would be down to 2%?
I don't think anybody imagined that. I don't think anybody imagined that we could have a scenario like the COVID-19. I think what actually enabled us to do that in the beginning was that the program was serious about fiscal discipline, and that we were actually convincing the market that we could have this growth generated by the private system. And it's actually something that works in a loop, because when you look at what happened in Brazil in the past, you had very high interest rates. With very high interest rates, you are not able to do a lot of the projects that demand funding in the long term. So because you need the projects, the government had to subsidize that. The more subsidy you do, the more the market understands that you're going to have a fiscal problem ahead. And the more the market understands that you're going to have a fiscal problem ahead, the larger is the premium. In other words, the higher is the interest rates. So you get into these vicious cycles that you can't get out of it. The way to break this cycle is to tell people, listen, we're going to grow in a different way. We're going to be serious about fiscal discipline. Then the curve lowers, the long end lowers. Then you start to be able to do projects with private money. And the more projects you do with private money, the more the market understands that you need less subsidy. And the more the market understands that you need less subsidy, the lower the rates go. So it's breaking from a vicious cycle into the virtuous cycle. That's the job that we had at hand.
At the same time, there's something of a natural tension that exists around a benchmark rate that low. On the one hand, it makes government borrowing very cheap, and that is clearly appealing to certain quarters of the government. At the same time, you've got very little foreign money flowing in. You've got inflation arguably at trough levels, and you have commodity prices starting to rise. So that raises a question of sustainability around an interest rate structure of this nature.
It's our hope that it's appealing for the private sector and not the public sector. And the more appealing is to the public sector and the more they use, the less will be for the private sector. So this is the game that we are trying to play and try to convince and to tell people that we believe in this growth driven by market forces. And we believe that we need to have a free market, and the prices carry a very important information, that prices should be free and that people should invest freely.
Governor, investors have for decades expected and even demanded that emerging markets like Brazil have a monetary policy that produces positive real rates and pays a risk premium over the developed world. Has the pandemic changed, altered that north-south dynamic for good or just temporarily?
I think, again, I think it's going back to the issue that we discussed before. I think the premium is also always related to risk. So if you have more risk, you demand more premium. I think there are a lot of movements happening at the same time. There was a global movement of removing the premium because rates was low everywhere. There was a government that told people for the first time that we are going to grow with private money, we are going to reinvent growth, we're going to do reforms. If we stop and think about, we have two benchmarks in terms of being able to lower rates in Brazil. The first one was when we did the ceiling, and the second one was when we did the Social Security reform, because everybody knows that the reforms are able to lower the structural rate in the longer term. So I think what enabled us to live with a lower premium was the policies that were adopted and the global environment. And we can't forget that, because once we forget that, we have a risk of going back into what we were before, and it didn't work.
Governor, in one of your old jobs as head of trading for Santander, currency volatility was a good thing. Now, as central bank governor, it's a bad thing. Business doesn't like it, and neither do foreign investors. How important is achieving more stability in the exchange rate?
It's very important. It's not something that you can cause. It's a reward that you get from having a solid and credible government program, from having credibility in the central bank, from having credibility in the FX policy. We've had a bit of a larger, I would say, is related to some of the factors that we discussed. Part of it is the fiscal, part of it is the lower rates. We measure the volatility with other variables, and a little bit bigger than what the other variables would indicate. We are studying now the factors that are provoking this volatility. There is also structural changes in the way the market works that in the beginning provoke volatility. For example, you have more small contracts being traded, you have more people trading FX. You have other countries trading more real because the interest rate is lower, so it becomes a cheaper currency to use as a hedge. So everything is in play. We are looking at everything and analyzing, but we need to keep our policy and to keep what we always say that is important for us, which is the principle of separation. Monetary policy is for rates. Rates is monetary policy. The FX is floating, and financial stability is related to macroprudential measures. That's the principle that we always use, and I think that's what has improved the credibility of the central bank, and that's what we try to communicate to people.
In your assessment, is there still too much volatility?
I think the volatility is a little bit higher than what it should be. If you look in the couple in the weeks before we start to have this talk about the fiscal problem in Brazil, if you look at the weeks before that, the volatility was going down, was almost converging, and then when you had the fiscal dimension getting into place again, the volatility went a bit higher. I think the volatility will tend to go lower as we approve the projects, as we build a credible program. I think we have measures to be approved in Congress that will show that we are absolutely serious about the fiscal discipline, about the ceiling. I think that will tend to reduce volatility.
Well, besides restoring credibility, which clearly is a priority for you, or maintaining credibility, what else can you do to reduce volatility? Is selling reserves your only tool in the kit, or is there something else?
Selling reserves will address the discontinuity problem and the level of FX problem. And again, we think the currency is floating. To intervene to reduce volatility, there are two measures that were used at large in other central banks. One is to intervene using options, because then you can sell volatility directly, and you can sell volatility by selling strikes that are out, are not at the money. And that's being used, but without a lot of success. And I've talked to other countries that use that. One other thing that you can use is to intervene in corridors. Say, for example, every day that you have FX that changes more than 2%, you're going to sell or you're going to buy. That was actually used in the past and also hasn't worked very well. So to have a tool to fight volatility, not the direction, but just the volatility, we don't have a good instrument that was used in any place that we think is worth trying at this time.
Just as you described the lower bound for the Selic, for the benchmark rate, at or slightly lower perhaps than 2%, is there an upper bound for the real US dollar exchange rate?
No, the lower bound is what I mentioned about the lower bound is the minimum that we think interest rate can be.
Sure.
And again,
I'm just curious whether you're similarly operating with a nosebleed level for the exchange rate. People look at the chart and they see that some weeks ago the real approached 6 to the dollar. It has strengthened somewhat since then, and people wonder whether that's the pain point that you're trying to avoid.
No, it's, in some moments on the way to 6, we thought it was disconnected with the reality and with the fundamentals. And there was an appearance of having some disruption in the market, and we intervened more heavily. We were ready to intervene much more heavily if we needed, but then the currency stabilized and went back to 5, if you remember. So we don't have any price in mind. We think the exchange rate needs to be floating, and that serves a good proposal in Brazil. So that serves a good objective. But when we think it's not in sync with our fundamentals, or it's creating a movement of gaps and discontinuity, then we intervene, and we did, and we were ready to do more at that time.
You were ready to do more at that time. Would you be ready to do more again in the future?
Yes, if we have the same conditions, the same problems identified as we did in the past, yes, absolutely yes.
Is there a limit to the amount of reserves you're willing to sell?
Brazil has a lot of reserves. We're talking about 25% of GDP. So we don't have a limit of reserves in our mind. There's a lot of talk about reserves. What we need to understand about reserves is it's an insurance. And the insurance has gotten cheaper. Gotten very carry of the reserves was paying.
Excuse me, Governor. We just lost you for a moment. You were talking about reserves as insurance, and then the connection died. So if you would just mind making that point again. Oh, it appears our connection is. Governor, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I can't hear you for the moment. Would you mind just speaking again?
Yes. So what I was saying is that the
there we go.
reserves for
So you were saying about it. Go ahead. You were talking about reserves.
Yeah, the reserves for us works as an insurance, and the price of this insurance has gotten very cheap. The price used to be the local interest rate 14% against investing the reserves at 2%. Now we are talking about a price that is 2% minus what we get, so it's very cheap. So what I always use as comparison is if you buy an insurance and you think the insurance is worth it, and all of a sudden the price of the insurance goes lower, for you not to have the insurance must be the case that you think you are much better off in terms of risk. We don't think that's the case. So I think the insurance, the reserves serve a good purpose. We don't have an amount of reserves that we need to have in mind, and we will intervene whenever we think is needed.
Governor, here's a question from our audience. What chance do you see in Brazil repeating the 1980s with a debt crisis and rising inflation? Either way, this account must be paid, and by Brazilian history, it's very unlikely to assume that public accounts will obtain primary surpluses.
I think before the COVID to a primary surplus, like I said, we had a detour because of what happened. Every country, I think, is facing similar situation. Some countries spend more than the others. We thought was important to take care of the population and to do the programs that we did. We think we will converge again to fiscal discipline, and we see that we're going to have a primary surplus again. It's not important when and how much is it going to be. I think the important thing for markets is to show that your path is consistent and has credibility. I think the market understands that everybody is going to come out of this with higher debt, every country. But what we need to tell the markets that we're serious about discipline and that we have a plan.
Governor, the Federal Reserve has entered a new era, if you like, in monetary policy with average inflation targeting. Is that something you think could be implemented in Brazil?
I think the Fed, in terms of using the tools, are much forward guidance for a long time. We just introduced forward guidance now, and apparently we were one of the first emerging market countries to do so. I think once you have credibility, and once you gain credibility, and once you see that the market has projections that go longer in terms of horizon, you started being able to use other tools. We can talk about removing the fiscal, the target on a fiscal year. You can talk about seeing inflation in a different way. There are many things that we can do. Right now, we are sticking to our plan, and the plan is we use monetary policy, we introduce forward guidance, and we see how that develops from here.
Governor, you're a big proponent of payments technology. You talked about digitizing 40 million people in the effort to hand out subsidies during the pandemic. Facebook wants to make Brazil a testing ground for digital payments over WhatsApp, yet the central bank hasn't, at least publicly, appeared to be very encouraging. How come?
No, it's not true that the central bank has not been encouraged. What the central bank needs to do for everyone that has an arrangement of payments is it needs to go through a process of approval. And we had a process that was a shortcut for very small companies. When WhatsApp entered in Brazil and proposed the arrangement, we understood that was a big arrangement. We start out with more than 100 million people. And the only thing we said is that because you are a big arrangement and influences the market in a big way, and we have all the prudential dimensions that we need to look into, what we ask them is to get into the normal trail of authorization, the normal path of authorization, like any other arrangement. And it will be approved. We have made a lot of advances. I've been talking to them. The main worry that we had was that it would promote competition and that will protect the data of the people. That's the two dimensions that we are focusing on. But we did not discourage. On the opposite, we are encouraging them. Not only them, we are talking to Google so that we can have Google Pay. I'm talking to Dan from PayPal to see how can they increase the business in Brazil. We want competition. We want competition from everyone. We want every big tech to be in Brazil, interacting with the Brazilian system and promoting competition, because we think that if you are able to lower the cost of payments, you are able to lower the operational cost of some of the companies, and that promotes efficiency.
The most advanced and widespread digital payments technology in the world is WeChat Pay. Would you encourage the Chinese to enter the Brazilian market?
We don't have a problem with anyone that wants to enter in the Brazilian market, but we also need to learn from others. One of the things that has become a point of attention for many central banks is what we call market fragmentation, where you start to have systems that have settlement on their own, on independent settlements, and they are not connected, and you start having this market fragmentation. It becomes very difficult for the central bank to monitor. You might end up with more fraud. And so what we worry about is that, first, we have a centralized instant liquidation system, settlement system, and that's why we created the PIX. And we worry that at the end, we're going to have a system that will promote competition. And it's very important to remember that you can have a system that in the beginning looks like a very competitive system, but you end up in a non-competitive solution. So for us, it's not only important that it begins as a competitive system, but that the whole process fosters competition all along as the market improves.
Governor, one last question for you. Your grandfather, who had the same name, Roberto de Oliveira Campos, a famous Brazilian, had a distinguished career as a diplomat, as a government minister, and as a politician. Will that be the path for you as well?
Only God knows. But he created the central bank, and I think in a way, because he created the central bank, it's an honor for me to be here. There is actually an interesting story because he created the central bank to be independent. And it was independent for 4 weeks. And then at that time, the president decided that it shouldn't be independent anymore. And he went to the president and he said, "You are making a big mistake." And the president said, "Why?" And he said, "Because the central bank is the guardian of the currency." And the president answered him, "No, I am the guardian of the currency." And that was the end of independence. And now we are back into talking about independence many years after that. And I think the country is much more mature to have this independent central bank which interacts with the system, promoting this digitalization, this innovation path that we are creating with more credibility and inclusion. So I am very happy to be here at this moment. I think it's an important part of the process that we are living. And I am very happy and very surprised with the quality of the people that work in the Central Bank of Brazil.
Well, you're honored to be at the central bank, Governor. We're honored to have you here as our guest at Bloomberg. I want to thank you very much for taking this time out to talk to me, to field my questions, to field questions from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik, and thank you, all the audience, and thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.